There's often a lot of doom and gloom written about Ukraine in the West. I guess good news doesn't sell newspapers, but bad news does. And let's not forget that most Western journalists still are based in Moscow, as they were in the USSR. They're not based in Kyiv. I mean, the number of Western publications with freelancers or people on a payroll in Kyiv is relatively small. And by the way, for the entire period of Ukraine's nearly 30-year history, there's never been a single time when a Canadian newspaper has had a stringer or a freelancer in Kyiv. So what does that say about our influence over the Canadian media? So when we complain about Western writing about Ukraine, we need to take that into account. We also need to take into account a few other points. Firstly, this is a very different situation today in Ukraine to that compared to after the Orange Revolution. You know, Ukraine's had two popular uprisings, the Orange Revolution in 2004, the Euromaidan 2013-2014. The period after the Orange Revolution was a complete waste of Ukraine's history. Viktor Yushchenko spent the entire 5 years squabbling with Yulia Tymoshenko. He had a visceral hatred for her, which was something within the realm of psychiatry, not political science. And that meant that very little, if anything, was done in terms of reforms, European integration, and such like. Also, Yushchenko could not decide who we wanted to go into coalition with. Did our Ukraine want to go into coalition with Yulia Tymoshenko's Butte, bloc of Yulia Tymoshenko, or with the Party of Regions? The situation after the Euromaidan is completely different. This period since 2014 has seen the highest number, the largest number of reforms in Ukraine since 1991. There isn't the squabbling between the president and parliament or between the prime minister and president as there was in the Yushchenko presidency. So that's very important because people tend to mistake Ukraine as a presidential system. So therefore all of the Western writing heaps blame on Poroshenko because he's the president. Well, they're mixing things up. Ukraine is not a presidential system. Ukraine has adopted parliamentary systems after the Orange and after the presidential, after the Euromaidan revolutions. Now, in both cases, there's a reason for that. If you look at the 27 post-communist states, the ones which have been successful in terms of democratization, in terms of moving towards Europe, joining the EU and NATO, have been countries which have adopted parliamentary systems. Countries which have remained hardline presidential systems, the kind that Ukraine had in the 1990s, for example, have tended to remain in Eurasia, in Russia, and Russia's sphere of influence. These are countries where you have authoritarian and kleptocratic regimes. So it's not a coincidence that the three countries, Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, which out of those countries in the former USSR seek European integration, are all parliamentary systems. Now, of course, there are different types of parliamentary systems. Ukraine is one where the executive is divided between two. So it's in reality a semi-presidential system because the president is still elected by voters, not by parliament. So the executive is divided between the government and president. That means that responsibility for reforms is as much in the hands of parliament and the government as it is in the hands of President Poroshenko. So let's blame what we have to blame, but let's share that blame amongst three institutions and not pour it all on Poroshenko in the assumption this is somehow a presidential system. Knowing the Ukrainian parliament, and I've done work there in reviewing Western assistance to the Ukrainian parliament, it can be a very frustrating institution. In fact, Ukrainian parliament is known for, and I've never heard of this phrase before, known for adopting spam legislation, i.e. it produces so much legislation that some of it is just simply useless. So there are, if there are problems to be shared, not directed purely at the president. What has changed as well, in comparison to after the Orange Revolution, what has changed in the last few years is that the European Union is for the first time engaged with Ukraine. That wasn't the case after the Orange Revolution. And Ukraine and the European Union have signed an association agreement, a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, and last year a visa-free regime. All of that will have a tremendous impact upon Ukraine's future trajectory. Yes, they are integration without membership, so Ukraine's not been offered membership, so it's kind of half the carrot, not the full carrot of membership, but nevertheless, one should assume that they will have tremendous impact. Now, saying that it's good that the EU's come on board doesn't mean to say that we should ignore the fact that the EU's just now come on board. To give you an example of the Ukrainian parliament, the US has been the main Western financial backer of reform of the Ukrainian parliament and the development of the Ukrainian parliament into a professional European institution. It began that financial assistance in 1994 when it was called the Parliamentary Development Program, and since 2013 it's called the Rada Program. Now, the EU has come on board to help support that reform of the Ukrainian parliament, because you can't have a parliamentary democracy without a sound parliament, but that's only since spring of 2016. So the EU's only been around for less than 2 years. So again, that's the context of what we're talking about in terms of reforms in Ukraine. Nevertheless, let's look at some concrete examples of what has been done. And this is by no means a full list. But talking to people in Kyiv in January, for example, I first heard the degree to which decentralization of Ukraine, and many people had kind of, were concerned that you shouldn't really do decentralization at a time of war, but it's become very popular at a local level. It's forced many members of parliament, local councillors, to, for the first time ever, engage with the local population. And more importantly, it's devolved a huge amount of financial resources for the first time to local communities. What that means is that local communities are kind of, in some ways in a bit of a shock that they have all of these financial resources to develop on local issues such as roads, infrastructure, schools, etc., which they never had before because Ukraine was a hyper-centralized system. That's very different in Ukraine to what's happened in Russia under Putin, which has become extremely centralized federation. Ukraine's gone the other way towards a more European-style decentralization, which was long overdue, and that's a very important reform. Secondly, Ukraine has created a huge number of new institutions and policies which will tackle corruption. The whole problem area of corruption in the government contracts has been resolved by this online Prozoro system. You have new institutions like the Bureau to fight corruption, NABU, National Anti-Corruption Agency. So you have a lot of these kind of new institutions which have been pushed to be created by Ukrainian civil society and Western governments, international organizations. They will eventually have an impact. They're very slow to get off the ground. NABU in particular has been quarreling with the General Prosecutor's Office over division of responsibilities, but nevertheless, you can't turn the clock back. These institutions are now being created, and that's a step forward to eventually have elite accountability, which has always been lacking in Ukraine. one institution which was always a massive source of corruption was, of course, the state gas company Naftogaz of Ukraine. And prior to 2014, Naftogaz of Ukraine would eat up anything up to 4% of Ukraine's GDP in terms of subsidies. Today, Naftogaz of Ukraine is the biggest contributor to Ukraine's budget. So it's no longer a cash cow for presidents. Also, a new report that just came out today from the Council of Europe praised Ukraine for its policies and efforts and political will, which is very important in fighting money laundering, which is obviously very topical today, but certainly that's something that's one hears about more and more in Ukraine. It's no longer possible, I've been told by many people, just to sort of wire, illicitly obtain money in Ukraine abroad as it used to be. Another area which, again, is very little talked about in the West, surprisingly, by journalists, and especially surprisingly because it's such a sort of a politically correct area to talk about, is gender. When I was involved in reviewing the Ukrainian Parliament in November, December of last year, this question came up a lot, the whole question of gender equality, gender balance. And there's been tremendous progress in that since 2014. Ukraine, in its elections in 2014, doubled the proportion of members of parliament which were women, which is now 12%. Yes, it's not as good as it could be, but it's a massive improvement from before. The average world figure is about 22. And Canada's sort of in the late 20s. But it's only 7% less than the US Congress. So the US Congress, which has just been developing democracy for 200 years, has only 19% of its senators and congressmen as women. In Ukraine, it's 12%. So it's not, is the glass half full, the glass half empty. Ukraine is speeding up. What gender specialists, experts will tell you in Kyiv, and what they said to me a few months ago, was that the gender question in Ukraine has moved from the margins to the mainstream. And that's a very important thing to understand. Opinion polls show that political parties today, which will include more women in their candidates, are likely to do better in Ukraine's elections. So it's not the case as in the past where Ukrainian men will not vote for female candidates. That's changed as well. You have about 52 women in the Ukrainian parliament. They have a very large caucus, and it's called the Equal Opportunities Caucus. You can find them on the internet. Within that caucus, there are also men from different political factions, by the way, and they're extremely active, and they held the first ever Ukrainian Women's Congress in Ukraine's history in the last 30 years. The first one that was ever held was held in November of last year, organized by them. So there is progress in that area. Sadly, it's not written about, but it's one of the areas that new members of parliament, civil society, with the help of Western governments, Canada, US, the EU, are pushing, and there's a far less pushback than there used to be, which is a good thing. One area as well that has been very successful in relation to reforms has been the whole area of banking reform. Ukraine had something like over 160 banks up to 2014, and that's been massively reduced in number. And many of those banks were used for money laundering. That's no longer the case. So that's been reduced. The banks, the ones that have been left to exist, are ones which are involved in bona fide banking. National Bank of Ukraine has also been heavily involved in being reformed into a new institution, into a more modern European institution. A final area that we should also think about is that Ukraine, since 2014, isn't just in a new situation because of a more active civil society, because of an engaged European Union. It's also a country at war. And a country at war, obviously, it's more difficult to do reforms in a country at war. The peculiarity of that situation is that Putin's military aggression against Ukraine, as on the one hand, it soaks up government resources. Ukraine spends, this year, will spend 6% of its GDP on defense. Now, that's something like 4 times more than Canada. It's more than most NATO members. It's a huge amount of resources for a relatively, less economically developed country. But country has no choice with a very aggressive neighbor, which is still occupying part of its territory and still conducting military warfare against eastern Ukraine. So on the one hand, that's a negative consequence of Putin's aggression. Of course, the positive consequence is that Putin's aggression has pushed Ukraine towards Europe and pushed many people to support those reforms. So it has a contradictory kind of message coming out of Putin's aggression. Besides Ukraine spending that much on the Ukrainian military today is one where a Polish think tank wrote last year that it's the first time Ukraine's had a serious military army of its own. Today, Ukraine's military is in a far better condition than it was in 2014. When you talk to volunteers, usually women who travel to the front line once or twice a month to deliver kind of supplies that have been collected by volunteers and civil society to soldiers, they will tell you, compared to 2014, it's like heaven and earth. Very, very different. So Ukraine government is supplying a lot more today, and therefore there are less need for certain things for volunteers to bring than it was in 2014 when it was catastrophic. Ukraine's military-industrial complex, which was massive in the Soviet Union, it was about 40% of the economy in the Soviet Union, is today producing very good new weaponry, some of which goes to the Ukrainian army, some of which goes abroad and is sold to countries. Just in the last month or so, the Kyiv Post has highlighted new machine guns published by made by the military-industrial complex, and new surface-to-air cruise missiles. Besides the military, Ukraine's Ministry of Interior has been completely revamped. With the help of Canada and the US, the militia, the Soviet kind of style militia, has been redesignated as a European-style police force. And I've seen how they operate in Kyiv. These are very different from the old Soviet militia. Within the Ministry of Interior, you also had a very specialized kind of paramilitary unit, sort of similar to the Italian Carabinieri, the Spanish Civil Guard. They were called internal troops, which is a very Soviet designation, and they've been transformed into a new National Guard, a kind of an elite paramilitary force. And they are also involved in various frontline duties, and also they back up the police when there are big, massive demonstrations in Kyiv and elsewhere. So that is the kind of things that have been taking place. Obviously, there's still stuff to do. There's still important reforms to undertake, such as creating an anti-corruption court and possibly land reform, although land reform is extremely divisive. Many politicians are opposed to it. Yulia Tymoshenko, for example, her faction in parliament, Batkivshina, Fatherland, is strongly opposed to land reform or the creation of a land market, land privatization. So not all pro-Western political forces in the Ukrainian parliament support all aspects of types of reforms. The anti-corruption court is certainly something that is being pushed by Western governments, international organizations, Ukrainian civil society, and is likely to happen sometime, I think, sometime this year. So when we look at the reforms and spectrums in Ukraine, we should finish on 2 points. Firstly, this very large body of politicians who came into power in 2014, everybody then talked about a kind of practically a constitutional majority of 300 MPs who were in pro-Western, pro-European factions. That's since, of course, divided up, and Samopomych, Self-Reliance, and Batkivshina have kind of distanced themselves from the ruling governing coalition, which is the National Front under Arseniy Yatsenyuk and the Petro Poroshenko bloc. But at the same time, people vote in the Ukrainian parliament depending on issues, not necessarily depending on if they're a member of the coalition or not. One of the quirkiest factions in this respect is Batkivshina, which has 20 members of parliament, and VOX Ukraine did a study of how people voted in the Ukrainian parliament, and they found that Batkivshina has 20 deputies, half voted always with the opposition bloc and half voted with the coalition. So they wanted it both ways. Maybe that's multi-vector Ukrainian voting. Yulia Tymoshenko, by the way, who is a very big populist on fighting corruption, VOX Ukraine found that she actually was very bad on voting on policies which were fighting corruption. So again, land reform is something which divides many people in the Ukrainian parliament because of the, this kind of sentimentality of Ukrainians linked to Black Earth. Yulia Tymoshenko, though, is in a very difficult situation today because Ukraine adopted last month a new law on the Donbas conflict, which defined the conflict no longer as an ATO, an anti-terrorist operation, but as a conflict whereby Ukraine is at war with Russia and Russia is occupying or temporarily occupying parts of Ukraine territory. Yulia Tymoshenko was absent from that vote. She's had a lot of stick for all that. The other thing we should bear in mind at the end as well is that when there's criticism of what's taken place in Ukraine, yes, we should bear in mind Ukraine's at war. Yes, we should bear in mind Ukraine's not a presidential system and that blame should go equally around government, parliament, and president. But the final point is that, the EU is a bit hypocritical here, blaming or complaining about reforms being undertaken in Ukraine because the EU is not offering Ukraine membership. If Ukraine was being offered membership by the European Union in the same manner as, say, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Poland, and more recently Montenegro, Macedonia, when EU offers membership, it also offers huge amounts of financial incentives. Then you have no choice to do the whole list of demands that the EU is thrusting upon you. But the EU is not offering Ukraine full membership. It's offering Ukraine integration without membership, or as Nicu Popescu and Andrew Wilson call it, enlargement light. So if the EU is only offering enlargement light, to be quite frankly, they should be very happy with what they've had in the last 3 to 4 years, because this is the reforms that Ukrainians undertaken have far surpassed anything else after the Orange Revolution, and have far surpassed anything that the EU could really morally demand in the light of the fact it's not offering Ukraine membership. So yes, Ukraine will always be a country there. We could argue the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. It's probably both. But yes, there's a lot of work still to be done. But let's remember, much has been done since 2014. This is a product of many different sides being involved: Ukrainian civil society, members of parliament, government, President Poroshenko, and Western governments like Canada, the US, Europe, pressing and pushing. And of course, the final push westwards was certainly helped by Putin's military aggression against Ukraine. In 2005, 2006, when Ukraine was looking at European integration, it was not certain at that stage, where Ukraine would go. Would it be indefinite Ukraine moving west, or would it kind of switch backwards as it did under Yanukovych? Today, that's no longer the case. Let's remember that. Today, there is simply no alternative to European integration. What Putin is offering Ukraine, which is a kind of a country ruled by a Ukrainian version of Belarusian President Lukashenko, a kind of a satellite country, a kind of dominion controlled by Moscow, will never be backed up and supported by any Ukrainian political leader. So in that sense, what Ukraine is on today, this path towards Europe, where the EU is finally engaged, is one that cannot be reversed. There can be zigzags, there can be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, there can be disappointments, etc. But the clear direction is one in one way. And I just don't see how that can change. For that, we can thank many different sides. And thank you for listening.